looking at you. It ain't got nothing to do with we love you, we knew you, we know your family. As a matter of fact, we'll take you in. You go into exile and come on into our state. And come on in, but we taking your land, your resources. Why? Because you weak.
How can Africa be so poor and yet be materially so rich? It's real simple. The answer lies in the structural adjustment programs, SAP, the structural adjustment programs that are imposed on African nations by the International Monetary Fund of Washington, D.C., the World Bank of Washington, D.C., and USAID. These three organizations come into Africa, loan money, and then charge an interest rate on that money that they know the African nations can never pay back, thusly re-enslaving the entire nation and, in fact, the entire continent.
I point out that when Spanish, English, Dutch explorers would go through, let's say, the Americas, there's a good example here for the African continent. Many of the places they arrived at were already abandoned. Our tribes leaders, our kings and queens, our priests, traveled the world. They were literate. They read and spoke many languages. They heard and knew. These guys are coming to take over the land. They got weird weapons, and this is what they're gonna do. They went back to their tribe, told everybody, gather up your stuff. We have to leave. There is an invading force coming. We have to go. So many tribes were warned. When this invading force came, many times they came and found the place deserted and just claimed it as their own.
Why was Muammar Gaddafi killed? Muammar Gaddafi was murdered because he, along with the other African heads of state, were about to bring into existence Africa's first central bank. They were erecting a central bank in Africa, which was going to do what? Back its money to the resources under the ground in Africa. Now, what would that have done to the global economic order? Remember, the United States dollar isn't backed on any natural resource. The British pound isn't backed on any natural resource. The Canadian dollar, the European Union, their currency isn't backed on any natural resource because Europe doesn't have a lot of natural resources. Africa does. So if they would have been successful in creating a central bank of Africa, coming up with a unitary currency, and then backing that currency to the material wealth under the soil, they would have bankrupted every other economic system in this world, from America to Europe to China. That was revolution, and that's why Muammar Gaddafi had to be assassinated, because he was about to help the African heads of state eliminate modern slavery and neocolonialism from the continent.
According to some, it's about protecting civilians.
And our resolve is clear. The people of Libya must be protected.
Others say it's about oil.
The only reason they're interested with Libya is about the oil. You think we'd be in Iraq if the major export there was broccoli?
But some are convinced intervention in Libya is all about currency, specifically Gaddafi's plan to introduce the gold dinar, a single African currency made from gold, a true sharing of the wealth.
It's one of these things that you have to plan almost in secret, because as soon as you say you're going to change over from the dollar to something else, you're going to be targeted. There were two conferences on this, one in '96 and another one in the year 2000, called the World Mataba Conference, organized by Gadaffi. And everybody was interested. I think most countries in Africa were keen.
Gaddafi didn't give up. In the months leading up to the military intervention, he called on African and Muslim nations to join together to create this new currency that would rival the dollar and euro. They would sell oil and other resources around the world only for gold dinars. It's an idea that would shift the economic balance of the world. Countries' wealth would depend on how much gold they have, not how many dollars they trade. And Libya has 144 tons of gold. The UK has double that, but 10 times the population.
If Gaddafi had an intent to try to reprice his oil or whatever else the country was selling in the global markets and accept something else as a currency, or maybe launch a gold dinar currency, any move such as that would certainly not be welcomed by the power elite today who are responsible for controlling the world's central banks. So yes, that would certainly be something that would cause his immediate dismissal and the need for other reasons to be brought forth for removing him from power.
It's happened before. In 2000, Saddam Hussein announced Iraqi oil would be traded in euros, not dollars. Sanctions and an invasion followed. Some say because the Americans were desperate to prevent OPEC from transferring oil trading in all its member countries to the euro. A gold dinar would have had serious consequences for the world financial system, but may also have empowered the people of Africa, something black activists say the US wants to avoid at all costs.
The United States should welcome the self-determination of Africans. They certainly have denied self-determination to Africans inside the United States, so we're not surprised by anything that the United States would do to hinder self-determination of Africans on the continent.
The UK's gold is kept here in a secure vault somewhere in the depths of the Bank of England. As in most developed countries, there's not enough to go around. But that's not the case in places like Libya and many of the Gulf states. A gold dinar would have given oil-rich African and Middle Eastern countries the power to turn around to their energy-hungry customers and say, sorry, the price has gone up and we want gold. Some say the US and its NATO allies literally couldn't afford to let that happen. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
Today, I'll give you the reason why the West is fighting Gaddafi. I'll tell you exactly what is really going on in Libya. I will tell you what the mainstream media will not tell you. There are 3 reasons why Gaddafi has to die. And among those 3 reasons, none of them have to do with him killing his own people. Number 1, Gaddafi is the one who gave the opportunity for an African satellite for communication. It is in 1992 that 45 countries in Africa decided that they want to have their own satellite. This will cover internet, telephone communication, and all other communications. But the problem was how to find the money for this project. Where did they get the money from? They decided to go to the IMF. But the IMF knew that sponsoring this will be more dangerous for Western countries. Why? Because Western countries were making $500 million per year for all telecommunication in Africa, even inside Africa. $500 million per year, not includes interest. That's how much they were making. So it is in 2007 that Gaddafi will come up with most of the money for this project. Africa will now have his first communication satellite, which will give the opportunity to countries like South Africa, Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, Libya, and other countries to now have their own telecommunication satellites. They will now provide communication to their own people. It will only cost African countries $400 million, only a one payment of $400 million to make this happen. Now you imagine how much money does Europe lost because of this? $500 million per year that Gaddafi made them lose by sponsoring this satellite. Just Gaddafi himself comes up with $300 million and other countries can impeach them. So this is reason number one why they need Gaddafi dead. 2, Gaddafi and African countries decide to create 3 major banks in Africa. 1, the AMF, African Monetary Fund. The African Monetary Fund will headquarter in Cameroon, Yaoundé. This was to be created in 2011, this year. With the African Monetary Fund, African countries will no longer need to go to the IMF, which is the International Monetary Fund. So just imagine yourself how much money Europe will lose if the AMF is created. When Western countries found that this is what was happening, they actually wanted to be part of it. I believe it is in 2006 in Yaoundé, Cameroon, that African countries decided that no other countries outside of Africa will be part of the AMF. Now you can imagine what's going on here. Not only that they're trying to cut them money, but on top of that, they don't even want them to be part of this. Because being part of this will mean that they will have to control what is going on. The second bank will be the Central African Bank. The Central African Bank will be headquartered in Abuja in Nigeria. What this bank will do, it will stop African countries from using Western currency. Like if you go to Africa today, countries like Cameroon, Cote d'Ivoire, Gabon, and many other French-speaking countries are using the franc CFA. With this bank, we will have our own currency, like the Naira in Nigeria. Gaddafi, once again, came up with most of the money for this project. And the third bank that was supposed to be created was going to headquarter in Libya, the Bank of Investment. This bank will control most of investment in Africa. The Central Bank of Investment. Now you imagine yourself what's going on here. Gaddafi is trying to break Western economy by doing this. But that's not his intention. His intention is to free Africa from his trap. African people want to be independent. Western countries don't want that. And that's what's going on here. So the money that Obama confiscated, stole from Gaddafi is the money that was going to help for all those projects. He's telling you today that Gaddafi is trying to kill his own people with that money. No, Mr. President, you know that that's not true. He probably doesn't even know because he has no experience. He has no experience. He doesn't even know what's going on. He's like a puppy. They tell him what to do. Oh, well, let me inform you, Mr. President, that money was going to sponsor all those projects. That money that you confiscated from Libya. The third reason why Gaddafi has to die has to do with the United States of Africa. This man has been pushing African countries to unite, just like the United States of America. The very first thing that European countries, when they were colonizing African countries, did was to divide African people. When you want to break a powerful home, you have to find a way to turn that family against each other. That's the very first thing Western countries did to keep us from being powerful. The second thing they did was to stop education. Make sure that African people are not educated. Education is the key to success. By us being educated and educating our own people, we are stopping major problem in Africa. And the third thing they did was to place dictators in power in Africa who will give them everything they want. And every time that the population will stand up, these dictators will have the support of European countries to kill those protesters. They were all surprised with what happened in Tunisia, in Egypt. And they took the opportunity to then create a problem in Libya. Not one of you will show me footage of the same uprising that we saw in Egypt, in Tunisia, in Libya. Not one of you will show me that type of footage. This was created by Western countries. When you go to Libya, you get free education. I'm talking about college education. Free healthcare. When you are newlywed and you don't yet have a job, you get free apartments. Libya is a beautiful country. And today they're telling us that Gadaffi is killing his own people. But yet he's the same one who is giving them everything. Free education, free healthcare, feeding his own people, and killing them again. Does that make sense to you? Let me tell you what the countries that are bombing Libya today have in common. They are broke. Oh yes, they are broke. Just the United States alone is borrowing money from China. Europe is going down with the euro. Every one of those countries in NATO are broke. And Gadaffi is making it worse by giving African people independence. And that's why you see Hillary Clinton going to Africa and telling African people to reject Gadaffi. Don't deal with Gadaffi. In fact, they've requested that the rebels open an embassy in Washington, D.C., making an illegal movement legal. That's what the Obama administration is doing. Hillary Clinton is also asking African people not to deal with China. Tell me, let me just ask this, man. What can China do to African countries that Western countries haven't done yet? I like to know myself. How worse can it be? Far as I'm concerned, China is not the one going around bombing other countries. I can't remember the last war China has been in. China is not the one killing African people today with drones. China is not the one fighting in Iraq or Afghanistan in the name of democracy. China is making money. Why not deal with China? What have you done to African people that is good? What have you given African people that is good? When you are going somewhere in Africa, in different African countries, and asking African people not to deal with China, what are we receiving in exchange of that? Other than bombs, drones, and everything else. What are we receiving? China is the #1 investors in Africa. The African satellite that I'm talking about today was put together by Chinese and Russians. We African people will survive. We've survived your drones and your bombing, your insult, and everything else, your humiliations. We've survived that. China is not going to do anything to us that you haven't done yet. So, Mr. President, let me tell you this. If you're not ashamed, I'm ashamed for you. I'm embarrassed for you. The first African-American president. And this is what you're doing to your own country, to the world, to the people of your race. You are the nightmare of Martin Luther King. He's always talked about his dream. But his nightmare was to see an African president of the United States of America doing what you are doing today, misrepresenting the black race. We're not asking you to give your attention only on African people or only on black people, but to show a good example of what leading is, of what fairness is, of what democracy is really about. The things that Martin Luther King died for. Not just for the liberation of African people, but for fair treatment of everybody. Blacks and white equal. Fighting together. Sharing. This is an embarrassment. And this is a shame. And I hope you stay a one-term president.
The United Nations says growing numbers of African migrants passing through Libya are being sold as slaves by traffickers or militia groups before being held for ransom. The UN's migration agency interviewed West African migrants who told of being bought and sold in garages and car parks in the southern city of Sabha, one of Libya's main migrant smuggling hubs. The head of the UN agency's Libya mission gave more details at a news conference in Geneva.
If you go to the market and you can pay between $200 and $500 to get a migrant that will work with you on your daily jobs or support your work. After you buy, this person is handed over to you. Again, then it becomes your responsibility. Many of them escape, many of them are kept in bondage, and many of them are even imprisoned inside an area where they are forced to work on a daily basis.
There are also claims that women have been bought in Libya and forced to be sex.
Black skin is a commodity in Libya. We're sold at cheap prices like chickens. I was sold, and I was still pregnant at the time. I was sold for around 1 million CFA francs. If I'd given birth in prison, I would have been sold for 1.5 million.
Men, so many here say they were held against their will. It doesn't take us long to find victory.
Just take us home. Just take us home. Want to go? No food, no water, nothing.
Victory was a slave.
We know that some people are being sold.
Yes.
Some people are being sold. Is this something you've heard about? Can you tell us about
Sure.
that? Tell us.
I was let us take us to our various countries.
These men are migrants with dreams.
Here's something you should know. The United States is conducting 3,500 military missions per year in Africa. That's around 10 missions a day. But if you want to know why we're there, you have to travel back to a time before the so-called War on Terror began.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there.
Before President Ronald Reagan described Muammar Gaddafi as
Mad Dog of the Middle East has a goal of a world revolution, Muslim fundamentalist revolution.
Back to the Cold War era when the discovery of oil reserves off Africa's coast drew the United States' attention. That's where we need to start to understand why the U.S. is on a continent where it's supposedly not at war. And yet at least 36 U.S. soldiers have died there since 2001.
You heard Senator Graham there. He didn't know we had 1,000 troops in Niger. Did you?
No, I did not.
Hey fam, I'm Imayan, this is AJ Plus, and today we're exploring the United States military presence in Africa, its impact, and how it may actually be fueling the ever-expanding war on terror. Africa has 54 United Nations recognized countries, and whether you realize it or not, the United States presence in Niger isn't an outlier. Let me show you. The dozens of pins you're seeing right now are all locations where the United States has had some sort of presence. Each pin represents a U.S. military training, advisory or tactical deployment, partnership, or base. And according to Nick Terse, a fellow at the Nation Institute, the number of pins we're seeing demonstrates a huge increase from previous years.
On any given day, generally there are somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 U.S. troops scattered across as many as 49 countries.
He says the United States Africa Command, or AFRICOM for short, made a 2,000% increase in the amount of missions and exercises over the course of just 1 year. If you're wondering how Africans feel about the U.S. on the continent, don't worry. We'll get to that a little later. But right now, you need to know AFRICOM is leading the United States efforts in Africa. We reached out to them, and in an email response to AJ+, AFRICOM said, its goal in Africa is to work with partners to disrupt and neutralize transnational threats, protect U.S. personnel and facilities, prevent and mitigate conflict, and build defense capability and capacity in order to promote regional stability and prosperity. Whew! That's not only a mouthful, but it's also an extensive to-do list. And Terse says AFRICOM has strayed pretty far from its original humanitarian mission.
It wasn't really going to be a combatant command at all. It was more concerned with humanitarian operations. As we've seen in Niger, Somalia, Libya, there's much more going on.
So why is the United States really in Africa? Comfort Ero, the Africa director at the International Crisis Group, says the United States presence in Africa is really a search for beneficial partnerships.
The US has had a long tradition of providing military assistance, training to a number of key African states that it sees as important allies in its own national interest.
Is the United States agenda the same as the local citizens and communities it's trying to partner with? Some don't think so.
If you ask local communities, locals see it again as sort of a new form of neocolonialism, a new form of sort of an extra sort of security blanket for the central government.
Ero says local critics view intervention by countries like the United States and France as unhelpful because Western nations support central governments that the critics dislike. Remember that, because we're going to come back to it. But before we go deeper, we need to break down the overarching theme in the United States presence in Africa. And it's something you've heard a lot about in the last 20 years, combating terrorism. The idea of Africa being at the forefront of terrorism prevention isn't some post-September 11 revelation for the U.S. Because before terrorism, there was oil. Africa really caught the U.S. military's eye when huge oil reserves were discovered in the Gulf of Guinea in the 1960s. The U.S., which already had global footprints, was largely absent in Africa at the time.
Africa became sort of the stomping ground, and you saw sort of proxy conflicts, tensions, global tensions between Russia and China.
But the United States' presence in Africa isn't only linked to the continent's natural resources. In the late 1990s, the world saw deadly terrorist attacks in Africa, and security concerns became a part of an international narrative. The 1998 car bombing attacks against U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania were linked to Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden, and the U.S. started paying attention.
There was an idea that places that were weak or fragile states, ungoverned spaces, these were areas that were going to be ripe for terrorist infiltration. And the United States pumped in, hundreds of millions of dollars in counterterrorism funding.
After the September 11th attacks, the U.S. returned to the Horn of Africa to set up its first military base in Djibouti. But Terse says the U.S. operations were ad hoc.
It was a very haphazard affair. There were training missions, but they were conducted under different authorities, under different combatant commands. AFRICOM has centralized everything that's going on the continent.
The United States wanted AFRICOM to be based on the continent in Mali, but there was opposition. Remember who Reagan called a mad dog? Well, the same Libyan leader didn't want AFRICOM in Africa, so its HQ was set up in Germany. But it was AFRICOM that started the intervention in Libya in 2011 that eventually toppled Gaddafi. So today, AFRICOM's presence is felt all over Africa. While AFRICOM sees itself as an agent against security threats, Terse believes the United States intervention actually may be exacerbating the region's risk.
Over the time that the United States has poured in counterterrorism funding, sent trainers to the continent, made this a priority, there's been a growth of somewhere around 50 terrorist groups, or illicit militant groups as they're called, operating in Africa. So they've gone from 0 to 50.
The United States' current strategy focuses on building capacity and capabilities of partner countries and their militaries. It's often giving those nations large sums of money and equipment. And yet, if the goal is to create stability, then the U.S. isn't always hitting the mark. Church says the U.S. has trained and supported militaries in countries like Burkina Faso, Chad, Niger, Mali, and Mauritania, only to have the militaries of those countries become more powerful than the governments themselves. Mali is a striking example. In 2013, rebels were on the verge of taking over the whole country. France intervened, backed by the U.S. and African allies. But what you may not know is that the U.S. had already been supporting Mali's military for years, and it was a U.S. military-trained Malayan army captain named Amadou Sanogo who took over the country in a coup in 2012. And guess what? He was even more ineffective at driving back the rebels than the existing government.
Mali has been in a state of an intractable insurgency. You have what might have been the best intentions, but instead U.S. operations in the region completely destabilized Mali.
But here's the really unnerving fact. The rebels got their weapons from the U.S. and other Western powers who were aiding them in Libya when they were trying to overthrow Gaddafi. Those rebels took the very same weapons back with them into northern Mali, southern Algeria, Libya, and Niger, and in some cases even used them against the U.S. and European presence. Just so you know, this happened during President Obama's watch. And there's still another major issue with the U.S. being in Africa. AFRICOM may be supporting militaries who have been accused of gross human rights violations. For example, the Salak base in Cameroon is integral to the U.S.'s footprint on the continent. But it was also the site of illegal imprisonment and persistent torture, as TERS reported.
There was ongoing torture over a period of years on this base. United States troops were not implicated in the torture itself, but it seems almost inconceivable that U.S. troops on the base didn't know what was going on.
In an email response, AFRICOM told us promoting human rights is a key aspect to the assistance they provide. They added that the law doesn't allow them or the State Department to give aid to foreign military units that violate people's human rights. And incidents like these have had a real impact.
The U.S. presence on the continent has galvanized local militants. They see the U.S. as occupying force. Because of this, the United States doesn't make any friends on the continent and often makes itself many more enemies than it actually eliminates.
In fact, a 2017 UN report determined that combating groups with these tactics makes it easier for them to recruit people into the same groups. ERO says the U.S. and foreign powers need more than a military approach.
We're not saying that there is no place for military intervention. It's necessary, but it must be bound up by a clear political strategy as well.
The future of the United States in Africa is dependent upon President Trump, and so far, his policy has been to give military generals and AFRICOM more leeway to conduct lethal operations. But isn't this really something the public and Congress should be debating?